Welcome to the Perinatal Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Christine, your host and certified perinatal mental health professional. This podcast is all about authentic conversations. We want to open up the discussions around perinatal health and well-being, from mood and anxiety disorders to breastfeeding to grief and loss in the perinatal period, and everything in between. While this is not therapy or medical advice, it is the place where we are going to continue to open up the discussion around all things perinatal mental, physical, emotional, and sexual health to help reduce stigma and break down these barriers to support. I acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which Perinatal Wellbeing Ontario is located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I am proud to acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. I acknowledge that I am a settler on these lands, and it is on these ancestral and treaty lands that I live, learn, and work. Welcome to Perinatal Wellbeing episode number 20. It's hard to believe, but today is the season finale of the podcast. We will be taking a break over the summer and coming back with more information and stories about all things related to perinatal well-being. Thank you so much for listening and supporting the podcast, and if you're new here, please check out all of our episodes from season 1. Today is part 2 of my interview with Vikki Stevenson, host of Blue MumDays podcast and mum to Stanley. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and check it out and then listen to today's episode. Today, Vikki talks about her experience with postnatal depression and anxiety following a traumatic birth. We talked about the grief and trauma that resulted from her experience with postnatal depression and anxiety, the fears of being a new parent and how they're heightened with anxiety, and Vikki's road to recovery. Vikki authentically shares her story to show how very hard it was for her, as well as how she got support and came through the fog. Take care of yourself while listening to this episode, and please reach out to myself or Vikki for support or with questions. You can find Vikki on Instagram at Blue MumDays, BlueMumDays, and you can find her podcast, Blue MumDays, wherever you listen to podcasts. I will put all of her information in the show notes. Please note that today we do mention birth trauma, postnatal depression and anxiety, we mention childhood abuse, and breastfeeding trauma.
Now that totally makes sense. When you put it like that, that totally makes sense. And the I'd say the trauma from the birth and also the breastfeeding trauma, I think for me, were like the two biggest inputs into or triggers for my postnatal depression, I think, without a doubt.
Absolutely. What did then kind of, you said, I'm not feeling well, I'm not feeling right, and really kind of not feeling things and, that numbness maybe that you were experiencing, which absolutely can be a function of trauma, right? We have to shut down at a certain point so we can survive, right? We can move on. And that can be so helpful in those moments as long as we can come back online at some point, right? What was going home like for you?
Well, I was desperate to get out of there. So I was lucky in that I spent only one night in hospital. Yeah. And I just felt so utterly lost. And I know when Matt had to go home, I just felt so abandoned and really sort of, I remember saying to like the nurses, what do I do? What am I supposed to do? And that thing of like, well, you set your iPhone and you breastfeed every so many hours. And then in the morning you need to wash him and dress him. And I'm like, how do I do that? I don't know how.
Yeah.
How do I? And that feeling of, you press your buzzer. It's like, I'm trying to breastfeed him, but it's not working. What do I do? And that feeling of you're being a bother, you're being a nuisance for like ringing that bell. And I remember a feeling of relief that we were going home. And, Matt was like so over the moon with our beautiful little boy. And we're a fan of kind of indie music, and because he's Stan, we put on Here Comes Your Man,
Right.
and sang Here Comes Your Stan in very loud voices on the way home. And I kind of knew it was a lovely moment, but I could tell it wasn't quite. I felt a little bit sort of going through the motions. And but it was great, and there was like flowers on arrival at home, and it was just, that was lovely. And I think we had we had a bottle of champagne because it was actually coming up to our first wedding anniversary, and because Stan was like 3 weeks early,
Right.
we were suddenly like, okay, we're not going to go out to that nice posh restaurant that we planned. So we had the bottle of champagne, and we had an Indian takeaway, and I had one glass because obviously I was breastfeeding, but then feeling, oh my God, so Matt goes to bed now, and it's just me and Stan every couple of hours, and just feeling lost. I remember like a really early memory. I think it was like my second or third night breastfeeding in the night, and just this feeling of utter panic of, I don't know what, it's that catastrophizing. Just thinking, I don't know the first thing about getting him a pair of shoes for school. How stupid is that? But just like, I don't know how to buy a child's pair of shoes. What are the right shoes for school? I don't know that. I don't know the first thing about maths homework. I don't know how to do this, that, and the other. And just this feeling of being I can only describe it as being like on a roller coaster and wanting to get off, but knowing that I couldn't, with any job, no matter how stressful, you can actually just walk out, you can quit. But being a parent, you can't. And I never wanted to abandon Stanley because I loved him dearly, and I never wanted to abandon Matt, but I wanted to run away from the overwhelming responsibility of, I am responsible for another human being's life.
Which is, again, like, let's normalize how scary that is. Regardless of,
it's a big deal.
Absolutely, it's huge. And even if we don't have postnatal depression or anxiety, all parents have a level of anxiety that comes in, which thank goodness, right? Because that keeps us on alert and, gets us to scan the environment for danger and make sure we're careful when we're walking down the stairs and all those lovely things, right? But it sounds like, again, that anxiety was really present. And so kind of like flashing all these thoughts in your head, like, we have to worry about this, this, and this. And anxiety is future thinking, right? Whether it's next week or in 10 years or 5 years when he starts school, it's future thinking, right? So like, we need to be prepared. Well, if I don't know how to buy him shoes, then maybe we need to make a plan and figure out how to do that so that I don't fuck it up when the time comes.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's how it was for you, but
I just, everything seemed like such a huge hill to climb. And I have this weird thing of like, if I don't know how to do something, I have a terrible fear of being exposed that I don't know how to do it. And obviously when you become a parent for the first time, everything's new.
Yes.
You fail and you try. So, like, so every time you try and put a nappy on, I remember, or like every time you try and lay them down while they're asleep, it's like detonating a bomb where you're like, any minute now it's going to go off.
I'm wondering how big of an impact then that feeling of, I don't trust myself now because I was told I was doing it all wrong in this like really vulnerable, scary place. And now I have to jump into this job of actually not knowing what I'm doing, because no one does, but doing that without that trust in yourself.
Awful.
So scary.
Yeah, really, really awful. And I do, sort of just talking to you, I do think I have a lot of damage from my childhood about, I was very much brought up, to feel like a failure or not good enough. And so that played out as a not good enough mum.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that so that was how it presented with me. But yeah, the anxiety was a huge thing. And I realized I think I had anxiety before I had the PMD, but I didn't know that that's what it was. And also my mum, you know, I realize now subsequently that I don't know that she would ever admit to herself that she is anxious, but yeah, she has a lot of anxiety. But it then manifested in not being able to sleep and insomnia, which I think is quite a common thing for people going through perinatal illness. And I developed a phobia of going to sleep during the day, like an abject fear of that, because it was like the ultimate loss of control that I just have, you know, when I think about it, I just have the vision of the corridor in our old flat and this feeling that somebody could enter the flat while I was asleep and hurt or take my baby, and I couldn't do anything about it and I wouldn't know about it. So yeah, that created a huge amount of anxiety for me.
And so I'm gonna just go there again, but did the anxious part not believe that you would wake up and hear if there was an intruder?
Yeah, I think, quite possibly. And that became a really big thing because everybody says sleep when the baby sleeps, and then that
Felt
becomes a
impossible.
pressure.
Yeah.
And you know, my lovely husband would then take Stanley out to the park in the pram and would say, you get some sleep now. And then he'd get really cross when he came back because I hadn't been able to sleep, even though I'd been desperately trying. But even like I put on relaxing music that normally would really soothe me, but it was like my brain was going, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to do. And you're trying to fall asleep, and I'm not going to let you fall asleep. So yeah, it became like this torturous thing. And the only thing that sort of saved me was podcasts and listening to, there's a great BBC Radio 4 podcast called In Our Time, and it's presented by Melvyn Bragg, who has the most soothing soporific voice. And so I figured, well, if I can fall asleep, brilliant. And if I can't, I'll learn something really interesting. So it's a win-win. And that took the pressure out of trying to sleep.
Right.
But sleep deprivation is mental torture for anybody.
Right. And then it keeps that loop going, right? Of like, we don't sleep, and then we're starting the next day with no sleep. And then the anxiety rears its ugly head. And it's so much harder to cope with our symptoms when we're not sleeping. Right.
Yeah.
How long did that last for you?
Gosh, I would say in an extreme way about 6 months.
Wow.
And yeah, because even before then, like I'd always had disco naps, like cat naps, and I was famed for my ability to cat nap.
Oh God.
And I used to be in an all-girl rock band, and before we like played gigs and stuff, I would just have what I called the disco nap.
Right.
So it'd be like a little disco nap before going out, or going out to see bands, or you know, going clubbing, whatever. And so to lose that ability was really tough. And you know, I remember saying to a health visitor, you know, how much sleep have you had? I've had 45 minutes. And again, that whole thing of like expressing. So you do the breastfeed, then you'd express, and then you'd have to sterilize all this, that, and the other. And I had an oversupply issue. So by trying to get up a supply of breast milk, like try and get ahead. Ahead of the curve. It's a bit like making podcasts, isn't it, where you try and edit one in advance. And because of that, I'd sort of overstimulated and got mastitis quite early on, and then I just constantly had like blocked ducts, and that created a big sort of physical anxiety for me about getting another blocked duct. And so I managed to keep breastfeeding, I think, for 8.5 months, but I was like bottle doing formula at night, and that made such a big difference to my mental health.
Yes, absolutely. Good. And what did the health visitor say when you told them I'm getting 45 minutes of sleep?
Said that's not good.
Oh. And
Yeah, it was like, that's not great.
and did they ask you like what's going on? What's contributing to your trouble sleeping?
No, not really.
Right. So
No,
no support really, like to be able to figure
no,
out what's going on.
no.
Wow. So what got you to the point, and how long was it when you reached out for help and you went to Cedar House? Like what was that like, that experience?
So I it's all a bit hazy as
Absolutely.
to how many weeks or months it was,
Yeah.
but it felt like it was about 6 months before I managed to get to Cedar House. I had help from my mum and help from my mother-in-law, who were both brilliant in terms of trying to, come to me to like a health visitor appointment or GP appointment. And I'll never forget, a health visitor sort of saying, I said to them, and my mother-in-law was there and saying, I need to meet other mums that feel the same way as me, that, is there a postnatal depression group I can go to? And they signed me up for a postnatal group, which is very different
Right.
because postnatal
Oh,
and postnatal depression are like chalk and
two different
cheese.
things.
And it was good in that I met friends for life in that postnatal group. But yeah, I think my nadir was when we were singing it, If You're Happy and You Know It, in this big group of about like 30 parents and babies, and tears just, literally it was like the floodgates opened.
Yeah.
And it's like I can look back and not laugh now because the irony of that moment. But and I was whisked into a room, and but yeah, I we had to sort of do a lot of searching for ourselves, and I was so lucky that Liz had just started doing a group in South London, because she was actually based in Surrey. So I think I went to the second ever group there, and that was a game changer for me. Like, I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't discovered Liz. I don't know.
Right. And especially because that was the thing that you were asking for. Like, I want to hear other people's experience. I want to have that connection. So it sounds like
Yeah.
getting into that group. Like, what was that like when you, let's say, did the intake or however that process worked, and you were like, okay, I'm going to this group on next Tuesday? Like, how did that feel for you? Do you remember?
I mean, I felt terribly
Right.
nervous. I felt terrified, but also thank God I won't be the only one. And I can't tell you how how amazing it was to just be in a room full of people, like, where they were all like, me too, or they would say something and it's like, oh, I get that too. And having that validation, and then having Liz as, I guess like the authority on PND, to be able to say, like, all of this stuff that you think is like you're going insane, that is all, I've heard all before. That is, yeah, you're ticking all the boxes, all the symptoms. So yeah, it was so validating, and yeah, I owe that woman my life without a doubt.
What, you know, it's so interesting because that's how we heal, right? We heal in connection, right? And we're not meant to parent, like have babies in isolation. And so, of course, the pandemic has, multiplied that. Now we're looking at 1 in 3 parents, with potential PMAD, right? Which is so high. Like that's people that are reporting. So
Yeah,
imagine the
yeah.
actual statistics. But that, like, there's other people, because I still get that reaction. Like, even when you were talking, and it's so interesting that we all have different experiences, and yet there's some things that people say, and it's exactly the same. Like, exactly the same thoughts that I had, or even clients that I have, and they come in, and in my head, I'm like, yep, I said exactly the same thing. I asked my
Yeah.
therapist the same thing, how long is this going to take? Right. Or how long do I have to take medication for? And it's just so interesting. And I think that's the beauty of groups of like, no matter how different we are, there's this like universality that connects us. And like, me too, right? Like that. Oh, wow. I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one at 4 a.m. by myself, nursing my child, pumping, crying, desperate for some kind of relief. There's other people out there in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. And that peer support, we're actually talking ahead of Maternal Mental Health Awareness Week next week. And I think the theme this year is about the power of connection. And you're absolutely right. Peer support is so important. It's so soothing just to have somebody say that it's okay to feel that way because it's part of the illness, or that's what the illness does to you, or that's a normal symptom when you're feeling so abnormal. And Liz was she's got such a brilliant way about it, that she just normalized everything, no matter how crazy you felt.
Yeah.
It was like, yep, heard it all before.
Yes. Yeah. Like you're not, because sometimes too, we can be like, no, but I'm really crazy. Like
Yeah.
these,
Yeah.
maybe you've seen it all, but these thoughts in here, they're next level. I promise, And like, nope. Like, yeah, it's totally typical. I've heard it before. It's like, you're not the only one, and that word symptom, right? Because again, I think what I see with these experiences, like I felt too, of like, oh, this is me, this is my fault, like I'm broken, this is part of who I am. It's a part of the experience, but it's not who you are. It's a symptom of an illness. Right?
Yes. And that's an amazing thing to emphasize, because it is not you, it's an illness.
Yeah.
And it's making sure that is separate, and that actually there are sort of, a huge amount of boxes that can be ticked that are symptoms, and that actually you might think you're completely losing the plot. Yeah, you can think you're losing your mind, but you're actually just exhibiting
Symptoms.
so many normal symptoms, and it's an illness, it's not you. And I think the more we internalize that and think it's our fault, that sort of can just keep the illness feeding itself.
And that's where now, like trying to look at the healing from that. You mentioned that grief, around kind of not having that experience with Stanley that you were probably envisioning, that you wanted to have. And yes, there's so much grief in there. And so I actually see, because I felt it for me, and I kept asking therapists and colleagues to validate me, like, can I be traumatized from having perinatal anxiety or depression? And people were like, yeah, why not? Like, because I felt like I can't cope, right? I don't know what the heck's going on. I don't trust myself. And so then there was visceral reactions even after healing of going back to that place.
Yeah, that time.
Yes. So if I had a bad mental health day, for example, I would suddenly have this visceral reaction, like this fear and this panic, like, oh my God, I'm going back to that dark place and I can't go back there. And so it was like desperation to not be unwell. And to me, I'm like, that feels like a trauma response because it's that visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah. No, I'd look at photos or items of Stan's clothing, like, when you have a sort of clear out and you pass things on to a friend or to a charity shop, and yeah, you just feel like you want to vomit. That's how it feels. And yeah, one of the local parks, I'm very lucky in this part of London that we've got some beautiful parks nearby, and there was one particular park where I had a really bad sort of experience, and again that panic about, like, I just want to be at home, and I seem to be surrounded everywhere by happy families and wonderful mothers everywhere. everywhere. And I was just feeling utterly panicked. And it took me a long time to be able to go to that park and enjoy it, because it was always like the bad place. And so it's been healing to be able to go there now, and I love it. But I can still get moments where that feeling comes back in a big nauseating wave over me. And yeah, it all makes sense when you talk about the sort of the trauma response. And I don't feel proud of the fact that, you know, the day I gave birth to Stanley was the absolute hands down the worst day of my life, and the first year of his life was the worst year of my life. And I feel such guilt and shame saying that, but that's how it was. You know, I look back at photos where, you know, I think many people listening to this who have experienced perinatal illness will relate to that. You know, where you look back at supposedly a happy photo, a happy moment, and you're smiling, and to the outside world, you probably exhibit like a happy parent with your baby, but you can tell that you're just, you know, the smile's not reaching your eyes, and that remembering that feeling of how dead inside you felt.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that, Vikki, because I agree. I feel the same way, like that, especially that first 6 months for me, you know, after having my youngest, was the worst time of my life. Like you said, hands down, worst time of my life. And that does hurt, right? Like there's that grief of like, I'm supposed to be so happy because I have a baby. And, you know, I loved him and I did have a connection with him, but I was disconnected from my older two. And I also have massive memory gaps from that time. And I know it's not just because it was 10 years ago. But even like, you know, a couple years later, it was still like, I don't remember hardly anything. I don't remember my older two from that time, like what they were like, what they did. I have no memory of that. And that hurts, and it's sad, and it's disappointing, and it's grief, and it's terrible. And it, like you said, can bring in that shame and that guilt. And so, how did that look for you on his first birthday? What was that like?
Wow. Yeah, funnily enough, the birthdays are big. I still think, actually, I still feel a bit triggered on his birthdays. Like I always kind of, like I look forward to it for him, but I dread it a little bit inside. And I think this is the first time I've ever even admitted this to myself. But yeah, the first birthday was really tough. All those mixed emotions about, we've made it this far, you know, big sort of mark in the sand for him. But then anxiety about like, should I let him have birthday cake? You know, all that thing of like, you know, I'm not giving him sugar. I'm not giving him sugar. No. And then it's like, but he needs to eat his own birthday cake. So I made a you know, a real lovely birthday cake, and then like sort of reduced sugar stuff for the kids. And now I'm just like, he gets the full mother load of sugar.
Yeah. And it is like a lot of emotions, because it's like happiness, like I brought a baby in this world and I love that baby. Like, you know, you loved him and you adore him now, right? Like, and you have that bond now, but that, and also it was the worst day of my life. And it, getting him here was a terrible experience. So it is like this mixed bag of really like heavy, polarizing emotions. Yeah. And that
it's proper jamboree, isn't it?
Absolutely. And like you said, looking back at pictures, I'm the same. Like I still like, oh, like it's your birthday. And then I'm like, because for me, the delivery wasn't traumatic, but then it was like, and then that led to the worst 6 months. Right. And then it started after you were born. So same, like around his birthday, I'm like, oh, okay, yay, it's your birthday. And then, ugh, shit. You know, and you're just like, 10 years ago, you know, at this time I was feeling terrible. And then I find like, so he was born in May, and then it was like November that I started medication. So by like December, the fog was starting to lift. So usually like I feel like this time, so now we're getting to it. His birthday's coming up, and it's like I felt so terrible in this time of year, like summer and I love summer and,
Yes. Yeah.
and then getting into fall where I was like, then I turned desperate for help because I was struggling so bad. And so it's like every year remembering that time in those seasons. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. 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 No, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just made me realize like how for probably about 6, 7 years, the sounds of summer,
Mm-hmm.
and like especially, I mean, it's one that's quite unusual these days, the sound of an airplane going overhead.
Right.
That takes me back to, I guess it's flashback to, yeah, this the one particular afternoon where I first experienced that, waking up in a panic because I'd fallen asleep, and where's my baby, where's the baby, is the baby okay? And so that sound from an open window, so basically every summer if I heard that sound, it would, yeah, again, that visceral reaction, that tightening of the chest, clenching the stomach, feeling nauseous and a bit sweaty. Yeah, I dreaded summer because it just brought those memories flooding back. Yeah.
So difficult. And it does change us forever. Right. And yes, in some positive ways, absolutely. And I think there are, it's okay to also admit that there's some things that are not so positive about it that we still struggle with. We're 10 years on, right? And still struggling with some of these things. And I think the healing part is then saying, I can recognize that and I can take care of myself. I can,
Yeah.
I can soothe my nervous system, or I can ask for support if I need it, or, I can talk about these things, like you said, in the podcast, and same with me. It's like hearing other people's stories and just being in that connection, right, can just help us to continue to cope, right?
Definitely. And it's great to have a conversation with, if you're lucky enough to have a partner or a family member that you can confide in, or a friend, and just have that conversation about what you need when you are having those dips. So like now my husband knows I don't need him to fix it,
Yes.
because he couldn't fix it. But when I'm having like a real dip, he knows just a kind word and a cuddle, and that it's okay, you're safe, and things will be okay, that this is just going to be a moment, and you will come out of it like you've always come out of it. That's all I need.
Absolutely. And it's so powerful, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah,
That's too, like, helping, like, use his nervous system to help regulate your nervous system, which is so helpful.
yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
But did you ever beat yourself up about thinking, and I'm particularly curious because you are already a mum to two, and a really good, successful, confident mum, but did you ever just think, why am I struggling? Why am I finding this so difficult when everybody else around me seems to be like just coping? Like I would meet other mums. Sorry, that's my cat.
Okay.
I would meet other mums who were just like, this is a breeze. This is so easy. This is just it's so effortless.
Right. And I think especially when we're in that anxious place and we're really in the illness, that seems heightened. And I think also it's a lot of it was not true. Like my perception, right? Of like, oh, they look like it's such a breeze. Like, really, they probably are going home and also, freaking out and having their struggles too. Because how can you not with a baby? Like, not everything is going to be smooth sailing, right?
Yeah.
For me, it was definitely like kids with more, or families with more than one kid. I was like, well, they have 4 kids. I only have 3. Like, why am I struggling? Or I've seen other people transition to 3 kids. And like you said, like, oh, it was a breeze. They were just like, oh, it's just like one more kid. It's not a big deal. Like once you have two, it's like everything, every kid after that is whatever. And I'm like, really? Like I'm dying over here. Like I am drowning. How are you just chilling? And then for me, it was Facebook. And so again, like you develop these like obsessions almost, right? Like for example, for me, it was nursing. But it was also like doing crafts with my kid, with my older kids. Felt like, okay, this is the ultimate like mom thing to do.
Yeah.
You sit down at the table, you like paint or do crafts, da da da. And I was never really good at that. And then especially with Liam, like having that postpartum depression anxiety, there was no way because I just needed them out of the way. And so if I would see like a friend or someone post like, oh, like we're painting and doing crafts, it would just send me on a total tailspin. Like, I'm going to delete Facebook. I'm never talking to these people again. They're assholes. Like, I cannot cope with this. I am the worst. Like, and still today, if someone like the word craft, like if someone's like, oh, I love crafting, it's my trigger word, Vikki. I'm like, I can't cope.
Yeah.
It's like, because I couldn't do crafts with my kids meant I was a terrible mother.
Yeah. Or it's like me with what, like crafts, art and crafts, not doing art and crafts enough. Costume making.
Oh my God. That's not even the
like World Book Day. I love World Book Day as a concept. I love books.
Yep.
The whole sort of getting excited and making a costume and face painting and stuff. What a ball ache and what a pressure, and that competitive parenting that comes out amongst the school parents, and I really couldn't give a hoot about that. Now I just laugh and just say, I'm not doing that. We'll do a costume, but I'll get it off Amazon or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Or we'll cobble something together, but I am not sewing. I'm not.
No.
Yeah, I don't have the space in my life.
I don't even know how to sew.
Yeah. But you get obsessed, and like, yeah, totally. I remember getting obsessive about those Pinterests or Instagrams, about the lunchbox.
Yes.
The creative lunchbox. And
yeah.
And just, thinking, if I can do that, then I'll be a good mom.
Absolutely.
But it's, who has time to do like rainbow fruit kebabs and
heart-shaped cucumber? Like what?
Yeah.
No.
Do you know what I did? I made a sweet and sour veggie stir fry for Sten and one of his friends. And I was thinking, sweet and sour, I loved that when I was growing up. I'm going to really make a special effort. And I even like made like little carrot flowers, not like the ornate like 3D sculptures, but it was like where you carve like little bits out and then you chop the carrot and into little circular discs, but it kind of looks like petals. So I went to all that trouble, and they both, I remember like Stanley's friend just like looking at the plate and then just pushing it across the table and was like, I'm not eating that. Oh, no. And whereas if I'd given them like literally burger and chips, that would have been fine. But that was a lesson in like trying too hard. And you've got to give yourself a break.
Absolutely. And I think that is a big lesson that I was able to take away from that experience. And then of course, and I know we talked about this, but like then later on learning that I have ADHD, it's like, sitting down to do crafts is never going to happen for me because it's almost like physically, I just can't do it. Like I don't play board games with my kids. I don't do homework with my kids. That's my husband's domain. Thank goodness. But because it feels like torture. But at first I was like, well, that means I'm a bad mom. Like what mother, again, doesn't do crafts or doesn't like do homework with their child? So now I've learned to let that go. Like I do loads of other things and my husband sits down and helps with homework if necessary. Right. And I do other things and I have other strengths and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's okay. And it's like you cannot be all things to all people in all mediums.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that. I mean, I still have literally a huge box full of washed out yogurt
Yeah,
pots and tin cans and like the inside of like kitchen roll
yeah.
and all these things for like home learning for lockdown,
Yes.
thinking, right, I'm going to do junk modeling. I think I've done junk modeling once with Stanley in his life,
Right.
and we probably never will again,
Yep.
but that's okay.
Yep. Totally.
Yeah,
And
and
the
it's
box is
it's
still
nice to be
there
in. Yeah,
for
yeah,
some hope.
exactly. Yeah. Because I can't quite bring myself to put it in the recycling,
Right.
because then I'd be a terrible mom,
Of course.
you know.
Yeah.
As you say, like what sort of mother would do that? But
Right.
yeah, it's, do you know what, it's so nice for us to be able to talk now
Mhm.
with one step removed from
Yes.
all of that madness and that horrible crippling feeling, and realize, hey, it's okay,
Yes.
and it's okay not to be the best at everything.
Right.
And you know, we didn't kill our kids.
Nope.
We didn't, you know, because that's the thing, when you first like bring your baby home, you just think, my God, I'm going to do something that's going to cause them to die.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you remember like the thing, you know, when you first get them home and you just are constantly checking that they're still breathing, especially when they're asleep. And I remember standing that weird jump thing.
Yeah.
It's like that reflex that nobody ever tells you about,
Right.
that apparently every baby does,
Yeah.
because they've been in the womb. So they're not used to having space. So they start doing like star jumps in their little Moses basket.
Yeah.
But as a new parent, you're terrified because you're like, he's having a
Sure.
seizure.
Yes. And so interesting that that's a big indicator that I see with people with postpartum anxiety. Whereas like I would go and like, okay, like, I put my finger under their nose, like, okay, he's breathing, or like look at them a bit. But then I was able to walk away. And I didn't really have that one even with Liam, but definitely that's a big one that I see with a lot of people where they're like, I'm constantly checking baby, like constantly. Or, I've had moms who are holding the baby monitor in their hand, going about their day, walking around, like if baby's napping or whatever, or,
Just in
just in case, right? And having like, I have the baby monitor in my hand when I'm in bed sleeping, and baby is in the cot beside the bed. I've had that one. So,
Do you know what? Even just mentioning that took me back to that feeling, and I could feel my stomach just starting to like, yeah, the baby monitor, and like being terrified that you weren't going to wake up and hear them in their time of need.
absolutely.
And yeah, I remember my husband constantly saying, we should be doing not co-sleeping, but like try breastfeeding in bed. But I had it so ingrained in me that I would somehow fall asleep and kill my baby
Yep.
by breastfeeding and cuddling him
Suffocate
in bed.
him. Yeah.
So yeah, so I was like really averse to, we'd have cuddles in bed, and and that'd be lovely, and especially like the three of us, and in morning, that'd be wonderful. But yeah, very averse to actually like breastfeeding in bed.
Right. Yeah. See, and I think that's what helped me, because I did that with my first, because I said before I had kids, I will never co-sleep. I will never have a baby sleep in my bed. That's me and my husband's space, blah, blah, blah. And then I gave birth, and then I was dead tired. And I was like, baby, get in this bed.
Yeah.
I'm too tired. And then that started it from there. So, and luckily, but again, like that fear, like some level of anxiety and fear is totally normal. And we want that. Like if someone said to me, I have absolutely no fears and no anxiety around parenting, I'd be like, that's concerning. Right?
Yeah.
Because that is keeping you on alert. Like, okay, be careful when you're holding baby, be careful when you're nursing him in bed, like don't roll over on him. Thank you, anxiety, for keeping me alert to that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. It's serving a function, a very
Absolutely. And
good function.
yeah. And then just noticing when that is feeling like it's overwhelming, or it's like all consuming, or it's really that whole physical body reaction to the fear, or it's like an obsession, right? Okay, then we want to say maybe this is crossed over to anxiety as a mental illness, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just kind of, last question for you in terms of your story, but like, when did you feel for you like the fog started to lift or, recovery was happening? When was that for you? And what did that feel like?
I think it was a good 2 to 3 years properly. I did feel immediate help through having Liz's group.
Yeah.
I did feel immediate improvement with the medication.
Right.
But I think because I was going back into like a quite a stressful job,
Right.
that I found that like hard. And yeah, I found it funny enough because I remember absolutely dreading potty training. Like the thought of potty training terrified me.
Right.
And again, it was one of those like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
Therefore, abject terror.
Yeah.
And it was actually fine. And it was not nearly as bad as I'd expected it to be. And so that was when Stan was 3, because I remember on his 3rd birthday, I was like, okay, cold turkey.
Yes.
This is it. With no more nappies. That is it. And I was in a good place there. So yeah, I would say by 3, I was a lot better. But
When did you,
and
sorry, just a little detailed question. When did you start medication? When was that?
I think probably around about the same time as you, maybe in the February or the March.
Right.
But again, it's all a bit hazy. I'd have to
Of
look back in my
course.
medical
Right.
notes.
Yeah.
But yes, I think speaking to Liz and Liz being so normalising about medication as part of recovery, that gave me the sort of reassurance to
Right.
to go for it.
And did you see someone one-on-one? Like, did you see Liz one-on-one as well, or just in the group setting?
No, just in the group setting. I did have one phone counselling session with her after having been in the groups. Right. So I actually was very lucky in that she let me go back for a second group, because one, I didn't feel like I was quite ready. And what's been wonderful is that subsequent to that, I had friends then go through postnatal depression, and I was able to put them in touch with Liz, and they were able to go through her group. And I felt that my experience was validated by being able to pinpoint, people to help, and being there for them when they needed me. And that felt like it was worthwhile, that it was
that real empathy connection piece of like, I actually do know how it feels. Like, even though again, our stories can be vastly different and our circumstances, but that, like that darkness and that heaviness and that like not trusting yourself, doubting everything, that excessive guilt, like you mentioned, just feeling guilty for every single decision you make. Like you said, nothing's good enough, right? We know what that truly feels like, right? And so being able to, I think, convey that to a friend or loved one, even a stranger, like where sometimes somehow you get into a conversation or something and you're like, I get it. And you know what helped me? Medication, seeking therapy, a group. And they might take that away and try something, and it might be the game changer for them.
Yeah. And I find sometimes when I see a mum with a baby, I'll sometimes say to them, you're doing such a great job. Yes. Because it's like the one job where you get no feedback. Nope. And yet, it's funnily enough, at this training day that I was on yesterday, and there was a mum there, saying, oh, I'm just a mum. I never went to work. She raised 3 kids. I'm like, You're not just a mom. That is the most important job you're ever going to do. That is not being just a mom. You know, that is an incredible achievement.
Absolutely. And then I think that gets so messy when we do have experiences like we've had, because we feel like, okay, this is such an important thing and something I wanted to do and I'm happy to do, and I'm failing at it.
Yeah.
Right. So then that becomes so messy, and, our narrative changes around who am I as a mom and how am I doing? And that's hard to reconcile, but definitely that, like, seeking support, doing groups or doing therapy can be helpful in like coming back to yourself to be able to see the truth, right? Like, even if it is, I kept a baby alive for a year, like, just like clap yourself, pat
Yeah.
yourself on
Yeah.
the back for that, because that in
Just,
itself is amazing.
just getting through the day sometimes is a real achievement, for people. And just getting out the house,
Yes.
just getting a shower and getting dressed
Right.
is a real achievement.
Yeah.
And I think there is so much pressure put on new parents that, actually just surviving, getting through the day, irrespective of whether you did arts and crafts. If you managed arts and crafts or managed to do some lovely baking together, brilliant. But if you literally didn't do anything more than like sit down and, watch a bit of telly together and had a cuddle, that is still an achievement and a wonderful moment. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you could go back and talk to Vikki during labor and delivery, what would you say to her?
Oh gosh, that's a toughie. You're doing well, you're safe, you're going to be a great mum. Stanley's going to be a brilliant little kooky, funny boy, a happy boy. That you are important. And I find that really difficult to say because I immediately feel incredibly arrogant saying that. But yeah, you matter. I think you matter too.
Absolutely. And then what would you tell Vikki in that postpartum period during those struggles?
That it's okay, that you're safe, that you are a good mum, and at times a great mum, and that even though it looks like everybody else has got their shit together, most people are winging it, and that one day you will probably be looked on by new parents as one of those mums that's got it together and knows what they're doing, or looks like she knows what she's doing, when in reality I'm still winging it and still, screwing up all the time. Like Stanley didn't have a t-shirt that he needed they've changed the PE days. So yeah, I totally didn't have a t-shirt ready, clean t-shirt ready. Like,
been there, done that.
Yeah, it's like, well, it'll be fine, doesn't matter.
Yep.
Whereas like that, I would have literally been eating myself for days worrying about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
So.
what is something that you do share with anyone that you encounter now who's going through a similar experience?
I normally give them Liz's phone number.
Yes.
Especially if they're in London, like
Yeah.
when there was like friends of mine who were going on maternity leave, I would like sort of put in their card, I think it was like 10 bullet points of like, you don't have to listen to health visitors if everybody else looks like they know what they're doing, but they don't. It's okay if you can't breastfeed. Yes, it is so important for babies if you can, brilliant, but it is not a failing if you can't, because some people just cannot breastfeed, and that is okay. Or if you mix feed, and do a mixture of breastfeeding, that is fine. So yeah, stuff like that. But I would say the thing that I found like a real breakthrough moment in helping Matt to understand what it felt like for me was being able to talk about phobias, because he has a real phobia of sort of being in an enclosed tube train or in a lift, and that feeling of claustrophobia and people sort of, you know, crowding around him. I was like, it's that feeling, but at any time, at any moment, no matter where you are, you could be in a supermarket and you get that feeling, and it's that level of terror that you feel, but it comes out of nowhere. And that description really got him to understand how severe it was and all pervading. But you know, gosh, I don't want to come on like this wise savior, like, you know.
No, but your experience and your wisdom is so valuable, as you saw when you know, when you connected with a group, even though the people were struggling at the time, but just that connection piece. And now whenever you do, you know, share your wisdom and your experience and how valuable it is for people, right? Or even just, I know how it feels, here's a phone number, call Liz, right? That in
Yeah.
itself can be life-saving, right? So
Well,
don't knock yourself, you know, it's so important what you're doing.
I don't feel it. Well, I feel like I'm doing very, very little. But if I do one thing, it's by declaring with a flag, I had postnatal depression. Why is it stigmatized? You know, let's normalize the conversation so that people, because it's so common, it is so common.
And
And it's still this big taboo, this big dirty secret of having a family. And it shouldn't be.
And 10 years ago, I didn't know anyone. I mean, I probably did, and they just didn't talk about it. So I felt like I didn't even know that postpartum anxiety was a thing.
Yeah.
It's just postpartum depression. And then that's when you hurt your baby. And so then I was, of course,
Yeah.
scared, right? Of like,
Yeah.
oh God, is that me? You know, because again, so much stigma. So it's like, yeah, just having conversation, talking, I think is how we're changing, you know, the experience of a lot of people now and down the line, right?
Yeah. And that it doesn't mean that you don't love your baby
No.
necessarily. It doesn't mean that you want to hurt your baby, because I think that was the only sort of understanding of PND in the UK at the time, was the very extreme cases of postpartum psychosis, which is actually its own separate thing.
Absolutely.
And it, yeah, because you know, I was like, I love my baby, I would never hurt him. And that's not to denigrate any person that has gone through such a debilitating and terrifying illness. But I felt really concerned of people knowing that I had that, because I felt they would judge me, that you don't love your baby, you're cold and closed, and
Yeah.
that, you know, it was almost like I loved him too much, that I didn't feel good enough for him.
Yes.
But yeah, let's keep talking and sharing stories, because that is how it becomes normal. And you know, the amount of people that have come up to me since I did the podcast, and you know, often women are coming forward saying, I still can't publicly say this to you because I feel it would impact on my career, but I had postnatal depression too. Or people coming forward and saying, you know, I was never diagnosed, so I feel I can't say that I had PMD. And it's like, you clearly did have it.
Yeah.
You don't need a
No,
diagnosis.
to make it valid.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then hearing that, oh, okay, maybe that is what I had, and maybe I need support now to kind of just process the fact that that's what I went through, and maybe heal
Yeah.
some of these wounds that come from
Yeah.
that, right? And
You know,
yeah,
it doesn't matter how long
no,
ago it was, you know, it was still a traumatizing, terrible thing, you know. And if you still feel affected or triggered by certain things, then absolutely, you know, you have every right and need to talk about it. There is no shelf life on when you can and can't talk about your birth experience. Or
Absolutely. And so definitely for anyone that's listening to reach out, if you relate to anything that, Vikki has shared today or that I've shared, as always, just reach out. You can even message me and I can direct you towards supports. Reach out to Vikki.
Definitely.
Absolutely. Just there is help out there. You are not alone. And,
Definitely.
we
Yeah.
can just keep talking and keep supporting as best as we can.
Yeah. You're not a monster.
No.
You are not a monster, and you're not a failure.
No.
You're suffering from an illness.
Yeah.
And you can get better from that illness, and you will get better. You might not feel it right now, but you will absolutely recover. And, the fact that Christine and I are here being able to talk about it when, I don't know how you felt. I can't talk for you, but I certainly felt I would never get better. I was always going to be like that. I would never get my life back or a
Broken.
sense of who I was back.
Absolutely. Like, how would I go on after, postpartum depression, anxiety after the third? How could I ever go back to work? Like, just thinking in that moment, like that will
Yeah.
never happen. I'll never be able to cope, and we have, right? And here we are 10
Yeah.
years later. And yes, I think there's some scars and there's hurt and there's grief and there's trauma wounds. And we're still coping and we're using that as a powerful way.
Definitely. And yeah, I just, and there's so much joy, in seeing our kids grow up. And
Absolutely.
I think P&D's made me a better mum.
Definitely.
I do. That, Stan knows that he can talk to me about anything.
Yep.
And it feels good to be able to sort of look back and laugh at some of the crazy shit.
Absolutely. Got a bit choked up there, but I think it's so powerful that we can share our stories, despite how difficult it was, and we can cry and we can be sad, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's okay to be emotional still about it.
Absolutely. Vikki, thank you so much for being so authentic and open and sharing your story in such a vulnerable way. I think it's, like we've talked about, it's so helpful for so many people. And I really appreciate you. I'm so glad that we met and connected.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much. And yeah, I absolutely love everything you do. And to think we were sort of kind of going through similar but different stuff either side of the Atlantic, it just goes to show that no matter what you're going through, there is somebody else right now going through the same thing and wishing that they knew that you were going through it as well as them.
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think the more that we can be authentic about our parenting journeys and not have those masks that, hey, everything's great, I'm having a brilliant time. Maternity leave is the best thing ever.
Yes.
Yeah, let's get rid of all those toxic positivity.
Yep. Yes. I love just being honest and open with people. I do ask them first, like, I don't want to scare you. Do you want to know the truth? And then I'll just let it all out. But definitely being authentic and like, yep, there's some parts of maternity leave I loved, and there were a lot of parts I did not, and that's okay. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vikki. And I will link everything in the show notes for people to go and listen to your amazing podcast with wonderful, vulnerable stories and experts, in the field on Blue MumDays.
Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Thank you. I am so grateful to Vikki for connecting with me on Instagram, for being a wonderful guest on the podcast, and for sharing her story with all of you. As you heard, Vikki struggled with her symptoms and trying to manage them while becoming a new mom. And Vikki was able to get support through the wonderful groups at Cedar House in London, and she was able to find recovery and wellness again. You are not alone. There is support out there, and you can recover from a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder. Don't forget to check out Vikki's amazing podcast, Blue MumDays, wherever you get your podcasts. and please feel free to reach out to myself or Vikki if you're looking for support in your area or just want to talk. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please share this podcast with any of your friends or family members who may benefit from it. If you feel you are experiencing any of the symptoms or issues that we discussed today, please reach out to any one of your supports. You can also go to perinatalwellbeing.ca for more information, blog posts, and podcast episodes. Check out our new episode every Wednesday.